In today's episode, we're exploring 5 people eaten alive during cage diving, from a marine biology student's fatal research dive to an accountant's deadly anniversary nightmare. Let's begin with the first story, where one woman's honeymoon dream became her worst nightmare. It was July 12, 2016, along a quiet stretch of coast outside Coffin Bay, South Africa. A small family-run dive operator prepared its lone charter boat for a mid-morning cage dive. The sea was choppy, with drifting kelp and low visibility as the vessel approached a shallow reef frequented by great whites. Among the tourists on board was Rachel Morrison, 27, who had traveled from Ohio with her husband Derek for their honeymoon. The couple had chosen the small operator specifically because it offered quieter trips away from the larger, more commercialized outfits closer to town. Rachel was excited but tense, standing near the rail while the crew prepared the cage. Though she had completed only basic beginner dives during vacations, she trusted the crew's routine and the calm way they worked through their checklist. This stretch of coast regularly draws great whites following seal routes along the reef. The sharks make quick, forceful investigatory passes, prompting operators to maintain sturdy cage hardware, though small private boats often rely on basic visual checks. That morning's inspection showed aging metal, but the dive proceeded as planned. When the crew signaled, Rachel and 3 other tourists climbed into the cage, settled into position, and gripped the inner bars as the winch lowered them until only the top section remained above the surface. Bait traces dispersed in the water, and the cage rocked gently between the swells while the divers' movements sent faint vibrations along the frame. Great white sharks are powerful coastal predators capable of reaching 15 to 20 feet in length. They rely on burst speed, strong jaw pressure, and investigatory strikes when examining unfamiliar objects. Most interactions involve brief, forceful contact rather than prolonged aggression, and their behavior near cages is typically driven by curiosity, not deliberate attack. Within minutes, a medium-sized great white passed near the cage. The crew noted its path from the surface, pointing out its movement as it approached the bait line and circled away. Occasional bumps against the bait float and light taps against the cage are common, especially when visibility is patchy. The shark remained calm and moved with typical investigatory behavior. A second shark appeared shortly after, larger, more assertive in its approach, and reacting strongly to the scent trail. The crew shifted position to manage the bait line and keep it at a safe distance from the cage. While doing so, they felt a sudden heavy jolt travel up the metal frame. The shark had delivered a forceful bump to the side of the cage while turning toward the bait, a behavior documented in similar encounters when sharks misjudge distance or react to abrupt motion. The impact stressed the cage door, which relied on a single downward locking latch and a secondary safety clip. Saltwater exposure, prior strain, and accumulated corrosion had weakened the latch housing, which fractured under the sudden load. The door did not swing fully open, but shifted enough to leave a narrow gap. On the surface, the crew saw the misalignment immediately and moved to lift the cage, but the shark had already turned back toward the disturbance. The shark's snout pushed partially into the opening with a short burst of momentum. Witnesses on the boat saw water churn around the cage and a sudden cloud of darker water rising toward the surface. The cage shook violently for several seconds, the movement driven by the shark contacting the weakened doorframe and the divers reacting inside. The crew began hauling the cage upward as fast as the winch allowed. When the cage broke the surface, the crew could finally see the full situation. Rachel was slumped against the inner bars, unresponsive. A large tear in the front of her wetsuit and heavy blood loss indicated a single catastrophic injury to her upper torso, consistent with a brief but forceful bite during the shark's rapid contact at the door gap. The shark had already veered away into deeper water and did not return to the surface again. The crew pulled the divers out quickly and attempted to provide immediate medical attention to Rachel, but her injuries were severe and incompatible with survival. She showed no signs of breathing or circulation. Her husband remained on deck while the boat turned back toward the harbor, where local responders met them shortly after arrival. Medical personnel confirmed that Rachel had died at sea from massive trauma sustained during the brief contact inside the compromised cage doorway. Authorities conducted interviews with the crew and inspected the cage and latch components. The fractured latch housing showed visible long-term corrosion at the breakpoint. The operator voluntarily suspended trips during the investigation and replaced the entire cage system afterward. Officials determined the incident resulted from a combination of equipment degradation and the sudden force of the shark's strike, noting that the event unfolded within seconds and left the crew little opportunity to intervene. Rachel's remains were transported to a local mortuary, and her husband flew home shortly afterward to arrange her return to the United States. The operator implemented stricter maintenance schedules and replaced aging hardware. But the case did not trigger large-scale regulatory action due to the company's small size and the isolated nature of the incident. Local safety briefings in the region later cited the case as an example of why mechanical inspections must prioritize latch integrity, especially on older, privately operated vessels. Rachel's death wasn't the only time a minor equipment flaw turned a routine cage dive into a fatal encounter. 2 years earlier, on the opposite side of the continent, another diver stepped into the water believing the cage would protect him, only for a small structural weakness to expose him at the worst possible moment. It was October 8, 2014, along a quiet stretch west of Coffin Bay, where a small private charter ran low-volume research dives. The modest vessel carried only a few passengers and a single aging cage. Gentle morning swells moved beneath the hull as the boat drifted near the sandy shoreline. Among the researchers on board was 24-year-old Kevin Nakamura, who had traveled from California to document movement patterns of great white sharks along Australia's southern shelf. He had completed dozens of previous cage dives during his studies, gaining familiarity with standard procedures and the cautious behavior sharks displayed when approaching bait lines. His supervisors often described him as focused and patient, qualities that made him well-suited for long observation sessions. Still, some colleagues believed his growing comfort around shark environments occasionally led him to underestimate small risks that accumulated over time. Kevin had spent 3 days working with the private operator, recording how sharks responded to subtle changes in current direction and bait placement. The makeshift deck station held his cameras, notebooks, and spare batteries, while the crew handled the bait line and monitored environmental conditions. Before each dive, Kevin performed his own equipment check, inspecting the cage bars and verifying that the surface-supplied regulator functioned properly. The cage itself was serviceable but old. Welds near the bottom panel showed visible corrosion, and one joint at the lower edge had widened into a small gap. The crew noted it as cosmetic wear, and Kevin documented the observation in his research notes without considering it a significant hazard. When conditions stabilized in late morning, the crew lowered the cage until only the top frame remained above water. Kevin climbed inside, carrying his primary camera rig. The swells were mild, but carried a noticeable surge beneath the surface, gently rocking the cage in slow intervals. As bait traces drifted down current, Kevin positioned himself near the lower bars to film the shifting patterns of movement on the seabed, hoping to capture footage of sharks rising through the water column. Great whites in this region typically follow linear patrol routes along the reef edges, using short bursts of speed to investigate disturbances or silhouettes cast against the surface. Their approach behavior is deliberate, often involving a slow pass before any rapid acceleration. Operators emphasize that sharks drawn to bait lines are not showing feeding aggression, but responding to scent cues and movement, testing objects with brief contact rather than committing to prolonged interaction. Within minutes, a medium-sized great white approached from the down-current side, passing beneath the cage before circling upward toward the bait float. The crew observed its movement from above, noting that the shark remained calm and maintained distance from the cage. Occasional taps were transmitted through the bars, typical of close passes in choppy conditions. Kevin continued filming, adjusting his position to keep the shark in frame as it turned and cruised back into the deeper water. A second shark, larger and more assertive, appeared shortly after, rising along a faint scent trail and angling toward the bait line with more direct movement. The crew repositioned the float to keep it clear of the cage, but a stronger surge lifted the cage several inches and dropped it sharply as the swell receded. The motion caused Kevin to shift his footing. His left leg slid downward, and before he could correct his stance, his fin and lower calf slipped partially through the widened gap in the lower bars. From the surface, the crew saw the water distort as the larger shark accelerated toward the movement below the cage. The shark's upward trajectory brought it directly toward the exposed limb, and in one rapid contact, it bit down across Kevin's thigh and hip. A cloud of darkened water rose immediately. The cage jolted as the shark withdrew with the force typical of a single investigatory bite, leaving the lower portion of Kevin's leg no longer visible. The crew activated the retrieval system at once, raising the cage as quickly as the davit allowed. Swells slapped against the hull as the structure lifted free of the water. When the cage reached the surface, the crew saw Kevin collapsed against the interior bars. The lower part of his wetsuit was torn open, and significant tissue loss was visible around his upper leg and side. The depth and extent of the injury indicated massive trauma, consistent with a single large shark bite. Kevin showed no signs of responsiveness as the crew extracted him from the cage. Despite immediate efforts to control bleeding and attempt resuscitation, it was clear that the injury had caused rapid loss of blood within the first minutes of contact. The boat returned to the nearest harbor while maintaining communication with local responders, who met them at the small jetty used by private operators. Medical personnel confirmed that Kevin had died at sea from catastrophic blood loss and tissue removal. Officials inspected the cage and documented the widened lower gap formed by corroded welds. Investigators concluded that the surge motion, combined with the structural weakness, had allowed Kevin's leg to slip partially outside the cage. The operator suspended dives voluntarily while replacing several cage components, though the low-profile nature of the business meant the incident did not trigger broad regional regulatory changes. Kevin's equipment, including the camera that recorded the moments before the surge, was recovered and provided to his academic department, along with his field notes. Kevin's case showed how small mistakes can become fatal underwater. Not long after, another diver encountered the same truth when a lower bar gap exposed him at the worst moment. It was March 22, 2017, off a quiet stretch of Baja's northern Pacific coast, where a small private charter operated inexpensive cage dives for tourists wanting a closer look at great white sharks. The boat was modest, carrying only a few passengers and a single steel cage secured to an older lifting arm. Morning sunlight cut through unusually clear blue water, revealing long, drifting curtains of kelp below the hull. Among the passengers was 48-year-old Thomas Brennan of Houston. His recent divorce had ended a 20-year marriage, leaving him searching for something that felt bold and defining. As his birthday neared, he booked a solo trip to Mexico, a way to prove to himself that he still had the courage to chase experiences he once postponed. He had only a handful of recreational dives behind him, all in calm Gulf or Caribbean conditions, but he viewed the cage as a piece of equipment designed to compensate for his limited skill. The private charter, with its low cost and small group size, felt like the right balance of adventure and security. The crew briefed the group while the boat drifted over a patch of deeper water. The cage was older but still in use, built with wider lower bar spacing than newer commercial cages. It offered better visibility for cameras, but required divers to keep their limbs inside the frame at all times. Thomas paid close attention, nodding along, eager to record close-up footage with his new underwater camera housing. By the time the cage was prepared, several sharks were already present in the area. Their silhouettes passed in and out of view beneath the surface, rising occasionally before fading back into deeper water. The crew watched them quietly from the deck, making small adjustments to the bait bag to keep the shark's interest directed away from the cage's lower panel. When conditions looked stable enough, Thomas entered the cage as the first diver of the day. The crew lowered it until the top frame remained above water, leaving him suspended roughly 15 feet below the surface. The clear visibility allowed him to see a wide portion of the seafloor, and the steady motion of the swell created slow, gliding shifts in perspective. Thomas steadied himself and raised his camera, angling it through the front bars to capture the shark's movements. For nearly 20 minutes, the approaches remained controlled and deliberate. A large shark passed at depth and then rose toward the bait bag before veering away. The vibration of its movement traveled faintly through the bars. Thomas shifted positions to track it and soon crouched near the lower portion of the cage to film its downward passes. The wider spacing near the bottom allowed a clearer photographic line, and he leaned forward to frame the shark as it circled below. The crew noticed his position and signaled from the deck, gesturing for him to keep his body higher in the cage. No words were exchanged, but the warning was clear. Thomas adjusted briefly, then resumed filming when the shark passed farther out. He remained confident he could keep his arm within the limits of the cage frame. A long, rolling surge pushed through the area, lifting the cage several inches before lowering it as the swell passed underneath. The movement caused Thomas to brace himself and shift his stance. His grip tightened around the camera housing. As the cage descended with the swell, his extended arm slipped farther downward, and the camera protruded fully through the widened lower gap, just for a moment. From the deck, the crew saw the water distort beneath the cage as a shark accelerated upward along the disturbance. The shift in movement was sharp but controlled, the kind of swift investigatory rise that happens when a shark reacts to sudden motion near the seafloor. A dark plume appeared almost instantly, spreading upward in a single expanding shape. The shark's bite lasted only a second. The force of the contact jolted the cage, and the camera housing disappeared from view along with the lower portion of Thomas's arm. The shark withdrew immediately, vanishing back into deeper water without circling back. For a brief moment, the water settled. Then the crew initiated the lift. The Old David moved slowly at first as the cage emerged through the surface. When it cleared the waterline, Thomas was collapsed against the inner bars. The lower sleeve of his wetsuit and the side of his torso showed severe tearing where the bite had removed significant tissue. He was unresponsive when the crew reached him. They lifted him onto the deck and attempted emergency care, but the trauma was extensive and the rate of blood loss had been rapid. The boat turned toward the nearest harbor while maintaining radio contact with responders on shore. Paramedics boarded shortly after the vessel arrived and confirmed that Thomas had died at sea within minutes of the bite. Officials later examined the cage and documented the widened lower gap, noting that the older design and the morning surge had contributed to Thomas's arm extending beyond the protective frame. Because the operator was a small private charter rather than a major tourist company, the incident resulted in temporary suspension of its activities while the cage was modified. The case was later referenced in local safety briefings as an example of the risks posed by older cage designs combined with surge conditions and diver positioning. Thomas's belongings were returned to his family, including his damaged camera housing recovered from the bottom of the cage. Thomas's loss came from a moment of exposure he never meant to create. But in the next case, the danger began with someone else's mistake, one quick panic reaction that left a professional diver unable to protect herself. It was August 15, 2015, off the quiet southern coastline of South Australia, where a small private charter operated low-capacity cage dives for tourists looking for a controlled encounter with great white sharks. The morning water was calm, tinted a deep blue that held its color even as sunlight crept across the surface. Only a few passengers stood along the rail, watching the crew lower a compact steel cage beside the boat. Among the staff was 35-year-old Maria Santos, a diving instructor originally from Brazil. She had moved to Australia 3 years earlier and quickly became known as a calm, reliable professional. With over 500 logged dives, she was trusted to accompany guests inside the cage, monitor equipment, and quietly correct inexperienced divers when necessary. The private charter valued her steady judgment and her patience with tourists who sometimes reacted unpredictably underwater. The cage used by the operator was compact and designed for small group dives, built with fixed interior clips and hose guides along the lower panel to organize spare regulators and keep equipment accessible. The structure met local safety requirements, though its interior layout required divers to move carefully when adjusting their position. The lower bar spacing was slightly wider near the floor plate to improve drainage and visibility, making it important for participants to maintain controlled buoyancy and avoid letting gear drift toward the openings. That morning's group contained 3 tourists, each with minimal diving experience. Maria reviewed the hand signals for ascent, air checks, and maintaining distance from the bars. She noticed one guest, a man in his early 40s, seemed nervous but alert, gripping his rental mask repeatedly as he listened. Once the briefing concluded, the crew secured the air hoses and lowered the cage until the top frame remained above the surface. Maria descended first, positioning herself at the rear of the cage, while the 3 tourists entered in sequence. Great white sharks along this part of the coast tend to make slow, deliberate inspection passes, rising toward movement or contrast changes rather than charging structures directly. Their size and acceleration mean that even a brief investigatory rise can become dangerous if a diver's position shifts unexpectedly. For the first 15 minutes, the sharks remained deeper in the water column, rising occasionally before dropping away again. The cage rocked gently in the swell, creating slow side-to-side movement. Maria guided the tourists to positions that kept them balanced and away from the lower panel, tapping a rail when someone drifted too close. The nervous diver seemed to be calming down, though he continued glancing behind him each time a shadow passed nearby. A larger shark appeared shortly after, rising in a smooth arc toward the bait bag before gliding beneath the cage. The pass was controlled and distant, but the sudden change in size and proximity triggered a flash of panic in the nervous tourist. He turned abruptly, misjudged the movement of the cage, and lost his balance. In an instinctive attempt to steady himself, he pushed sharply backward, straight into Maria. The impact knocked her off her footing. She reached for a bar to stabilize herself, but the motion of the swell pulled the cage slightly upward at the same moment. As she shifted, her main air regulator hose snagged on one of the small metal clips welded to the lower portion of the cage frame. The tension pinned her sideways against the lower bars. Her right shoulder pressed near one of the wider openings. Maria tried to free herself, but the angle of the snag held her firmly. The crew on deck saw the sudden jolt in her posture and moved toward the cage, but their attention shifted instantly when the larger shark curved back along the down-current side of the structure. The movement from within the cage, Maria's shoulder pinned and involuntarily exposed near the lower opening, created a brief flash of contrast in the water. The shark's response was immediate. It rose from below in a short, rapid arc, jaws closing across Maria's exposed upper arm and shoulder in a single investigatory bite. A dark plume expanded instantly, drifting upward. The impact shook the cage, and the shark withdrew just as quickly, disappearing into deeper water without circling back. The tourists froze in place. Maria slumped against the bars, still partially held by the snagged hose. The crew initiated the lift, raising the cage steadily until it broke the surface. When they reached her, the severity of the injury was immediately apparent. The bite had removed significant tissue from her arm and shoulder, and the extent of blood loss indicated the trauma had been catastrophic within moments of contact. They brought her onto the deck and attempted emergency care, but her injuries were incompatible with survival. The boat returned to harbor under radio coordination with local responders, who confirmed that Maria had died at sea. Investigators later examined the cage and noted the location of the snagged regulator hose, as well as the slightly widened lower bar gap where Maria's shoulder had been exposed. The operator temporarily suspended activities, replacing the lower clips and updating the cage's internal layout to prevent equipment entanglement. The incident was referenced in regional safety briefings as an example of how panic inside a confined space can lead to unexpected exposure, even for trained professionals. But even when professionals followed proper protocols, equipment failures could create deadly situations that no amount of experience could overcome. In South Africa, an accountant's anniversary celebration would become a nightmare when substandard repairs failed at the worst possible moment. It was June 4th, 2013, along a quiet stretch of the Western Cape, where a small independent operator prepared for a low-capacity cage dive. Early swell lifted the boat in slow intervals as a few passengers gathered at the rail, watching the crew secure the compact steel cage for the morning's first descent. Among them was 41-year-old Christopher Hayes from Toronto, celebrating his 15th wedding anniversary with his wife, Jennifer. The trip to South Africa had been her idea, a chance to do something memorable after years of routine vacations. Christopher rarely sought out risk, spending most of his time in offices and conference rooms, but he had agreed to the cage dive after researching its safety record. He took comfort in the fact that thousands of tourists completed such trips every year without incident. His swimming experience was limited, but the crew assured him the cage would remain at the surface, with air supplied from the boat. The operator used a compact cage intended for 2 or 3 3 participants at a time. The door was secured by a downward-locking latch and a secondary sliding pin, both of which met local safety requirements. The equipment showed signs of frequent use, minor scuffs, worn paint, and slight looseness in the hinge hardware, but the structure remained functional and within acceptable limits. Christopher listened carefully during the safety briefing, nodding along as the crew explained how to enter, where to stand, and how to keep limbs within the bars at all times. Visibility improved as the boat stopped in deeper water. The crew positioned the bait bag several feet from the cage to encourage controlled shark passes rather than direct approaches. Jennifer stayed on deck with the camera, while Christopher prepared to enter the cage with one other tourist. He moved slowly down the ladder, gripping the bars as the cage rocked in the long, rolling swell. Great whites in this region typically approached bait lines in wide, cautious arcs, testing movement before rising closer to the surface. Their behavior was rarely aggressive toward cages, but their speed and size made any sudden change in conditions a potential hazard. For the first 10 minutes, the sharks remained deeper in the water column, their silhouettes visible only briefly before fading into the darker blue beneath the cage. Christopher steadied himself along the left interior of the cage. The other tourist stayed on the right side, gripping the bars with both hands. The swell created slow, rhythmic side-to-side motion, enough to shift the cage a few inches in either direction as the lifting arm flexed with the movement. At one point, a stronger surge passed through the area, pushing the cage slightly off-center. The crew took note and adjusted the slack on the support line, but continued the dive, assessing the conditions as manageable. A larger white shark appeared shortly afterward, rising toward the bait in a deliberate, measured movement. Christopher lifted his waterproof camera, angling it for a clear shot of the shark as it passed several feet below. The shark's upward glide sent a faint vibration through the water, causing the cage to sway slightly. The shift was subtle, but enough to place tension on the cage door as the swell rolled beneath it. The downward-locking latch held, but the sliding pin, jarred by the earlier surges, sat a few millimeters short of full engagement. The next swell lifted the cage and set it down again, just as Christopher leaned forward for a closer angle. The movement misaligned the door by a fraction of an inch, just enough for the top edge to crack open a small gap near the hinge side. Christopher did not notice the change. Focused on the camera screen, he stepped forward to capture the shark as it curved back along the bait line. His fin slipped slightly on the shifting cage floor, and his left shoulder pressed toward the narrow opening. The motion exposed a portion of his upper arm through the gap. From the deck, the crew saw the water distort as the shark turned back along its previous path. The shift in contrast near the cage, Christopher's arm, momentarily outside the frame, caught the shark's attention. It rose in a short, rapid burst, typical of an investigatory contact, jaws closing across the exposed section of his arm and side in a single decisive bite. A dark plume spread upward immediately. The cage jolted from the force of the brief contact, and the shark withdrew just as quickly, disappearing into deeper water. The other diver pressed back against the opposite side of the cage, frozen in shock. Christopher slumped sideways, pinned partially by the half-open door, until the crew initiated the lift. The cage emerged through the surface moments later. When the crew reached him, the severity of the injury was immediately evident. The bite had removed significant tissue from his upper arm and side, and the rapid blood loss left no opportunity for effective intervention. Christopher showed no signs of responsiveness as they lifted him onto the deck and attempted emergency care. The boat returned to the nearest harbor under radio coordination with local responders. Paramedics boarded upon arrival and confirmed that Christopher had died at sea from catastrophic blood loss. Investigators examined the cage and identified the misaligned door latch, noting the combination of surge motion and incomplete secondary pin engagement. The operator temporarily suspended its dives while the latch system was replaced and the door hardware reinforced. Regional safety briefings later referenced the case as an example of how small mechanical shifts combined with diver positioning can create unexpected exposure during what appears to be a routine encounter. Jennifer returned home with their belongings and a detailed account of the incident, completing a trip meant to celebrate their marriage under circumstances neither had imagined. Thanks for watching. Click the next video showing how apex predators turn routine encounters deadly.